I began to notice something strange about the way we talk about manifestation. Most people imagine it as a process of getting something from the outside world, a new opportunity, a different circumstance, a future event that somehow arrives because we thought about it long enough. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized that the real mystery may have very little to do with attracting anything at all. Instead, it may have everything to do with perception. Because before any possibility becomes visible in our lives, it first has to become visible in our minds. Think about that for a moment. At any given second, millions of pieces of information are moving through our environment. Sounds, patterns, opportunities, conversations, expressions, signals. Yet our conscious awareness notices only a tiny fraction of them. Our brains are constantly filtering reality, deciding what matters and what doesn't. What fascinates me is that this filter is not fixed. It changes. And one of the forces that appears to shape it most powerfully is belief. Not belief as blind faith. Belief as an internal expectation about what is possible. Imagine walking through a crowded city street. If I believe there are opportunities everywhere, I begin noticing conversations, connections, ideas, and possibilities that someone else might completely overlook. If I believe there are no opportunities, I can walk down that exact same street and see nothing but obstacles. The environment hasn't changed. The filter has. And suddenly manifestation begins to look less like magic and more like a profound interaction between consciousness and perception. Modern neuroscience has been uncovering remarkable insights into how expectation influences awareness. Our brains are not passive cameras recording reality exactly as it exists. They are active prediction systems. Before information even reaches conscious awareness, the brain is already making educated guesses about what it expects to encounter. In other words, we are not simply seeing reality. We are participating in its interpretation. That realization changed the way I think about possibility. Because if my expectations influence what I notice, and what I notice influences the choices I make, and those choices influence the outcomes I experience, then belief becomes far more than a mental attitude. It becomes a force that quietly shapes the trajectory of a life. Not through supernatural intervention, through perception, behavior, attention, and action. And yet there is another layer to this story that becomes even more intriguing. Because beliefs are not just thoughts floating inside the mind. They are experiences felt throughout the body. I remember reading studies exploring how emotional states influence physiological responses. The findings were extraordinary. Different emotional experiences can produce measurable changes in heart rhythm, hormone activity, immune function, and neurological signaling. The body is constantly listening to the mind. But what surprised me most was discovering that the communication flows both directions. The mind influences the body. The body influences the mind. Together they form a continuous feedback loop. This is where the conversation around manifestation often misses something important. People focus on thoughts. But thoughts alone may represent only part of the equation. What if the emotional state beneath those thoughts is equally important? Imagine someone repeating positive statements every day while internally feeling fear, doubt, frustration, or hopelessness. On the surface, the words sound empowering. Underneath, the emotional signal tells a completely different story. The conscious mind says one thing, the body feels another, and the nervous system responds to what is emotionally experienced far more than what is intellectually declared. I began thinking about moments in my own life when I felt completely aligned, not necessarily successful, not necessarily certain, but aligned. The moments when my thoughts, emotions, and actions seemed to move in the same direction, there was a sense of coherence, an internal consistency. And looking back, those periods often preceded significant changes. Not because reality suddenly obeyed my wishes, but because I showed up differently. I noticed different possibilities. I responded differently to challenges. I took actions that my previous self would never have considered. The transformation happened internally before it appeared externally. This idea becomes even more compelling when viewed through the lens of ancient wisdom traditions. Across many cultures separated by geography and time, there appears a recurring observation about human experience. The outer world often reflects patterns that first emerge within, not as a mystical guarantee, not as a simplistic formula, but as a recognition that our internal state influences how we engage with reality. For centuries, people observed this principle through introspection and lived experience. Today, modern science is beginning to explore similar territory through psychology, neuroscience, and physiology. Different languages, different methodologies, yet sometimes pointing towards surprisingly similar questions. How does consciousness shape experience? How do emotions influence perception? How does expectation affect behavior? And perhaps most importantly, how much of human potential remains unexplored? That last question stays with me, because we often assume we understand the limits of our capabilities. We create identities based on past experiences. We tell ourselves stories about who we are, what we deserve, what we can achieve, what is realistic, what is impossible. Then something unexpected happens. A person discovers a talent they never knew existed. Someone recovers from circumstances they once believed were permanent. An individual changes lifelong patterns and becomes almost unrecognizable compared to the person they used to be. Suddenly, the boundary they accepted as real begins to dissolve. What changed? In many cases, the external world changed very little at first. The deeper shift occurred within consciousness itself. A new possibility became believable. And once it became believable, new behaviors emerged. New actions followed. New experiences accumulated. Eventually, an entirely different reality appeared, not because reality was forced to change, because the person interacting with reality changed. This is where manifestation begins to take on a more grounded and fascinating meaning. Perhaps it is not about controlling the universe. Perhaps it is about transforming the lens through which we experience it. And when that lens changes, the world that comes into focus changes as well. The opportunities we notice change. The risks we are willing to take change. The conversations we have change. Even our biological responses to stress, uncertainty, and challenge begin to shift. What appears from the outside as a sudden breakthrough may actually be the visible result of countless invisible changes occurring beneath the surface. Changes in attention, changes in expectation, changes in emotional energy, changes in identity. And this raises an even deeper question, one that becomes impossible to ignore once we begin examining the relationship between consciousness and reality closely enough. Because if our internal state can influence what we perceive can influence what we create, and what we create can reshape the future we eventually experience, then we are left wondering whether human potential has less to do with acquiring something new and far more to do with remembering capacities that have been present all along, waiting quietly beneath the noise of everyday life, waiting for the moment when we become aware of them. I find that possibility both humbling and fascinating, because throughout most of human history, we have been trained to look outward for the causes of change. We look at circumstances, environments, resources, and external conditions. All of these matter, of course. They shape our experiences in profound ways. But there is another dimension of change that is often overlooked precisely because it is invisible. It happens within awareness itself. If you've ever learned a new word and suddenly started hearing it everywhere, you've already experienced a small glimpse of this phenomenon. The word wasn't newly created. People weren't suddenly using it more often. What changed was your awareness. The moment your mind assigned significance to that pattern, it began appearing everywhere. This simple experience reveals something extraordinary about human consciousness. We do not merely discover reality. In many ways, we organize it. The patterns we consider meaningful rise into awareness. The patterns we dismiss fade into the background. And this makes me wonder how many possibilities pass by unnoticed every day. How many opportunities never register because they don't fit the expectations we currently hold? How many solutions remain invisible because our attention is focused exclusively on problems? How many versions of ourselves remain unexplored because we become attached to familiar identities? The longer I reflect on these questions, the more I realize that personal transformation often begins long before visible results appear. In fact, there is usually a period when nothing seems to be happening at all. Externally, life may look exactly the same. The same routines, the same environment, the same challenges. Yet internally, something subtle is shifting. A new idea takes root. A different perspective emerges. An old assumption begins to lose its grip. At first, these changes are almost impossible to detect, like the earliest moments before sunrise, when darkness still dominates the sky. But eventually, enough small shifts accumulate that a threshold is crossed. And once that threshold is crossed, the world begins to look different. Not because reality has transformed overnight, because perception has. I think this is one reason genuine inner growth can feel so difficult. We live in a culture that celebrates immediate results, visible progress, instant feedback. But consciousness doesn't always operate on those timelines. Many of the most important changes occur beneath the surface for long periods before becoming visible. A seed does not become a tree the moment it touches the soil. There is an unseen process taking place first. Roots form before branches appear. Foundations develop before structures rise. In much the same way, the deepest human transformations often begin in places no one else can see. A shift in perspective, a shift in emotional resilience, a shift in self-perception. These changes may seem small, but they alter the entire system from which future actions emerge. And that brings us to another fascinating aspect of manifestation that is rarely discussed: the role of emotional memory. Many of us think of memory as something stored in the brain, a collection of events and information from the past. But emotional experiences often leave impressions that extend beyond conscious recollection. A person may logically understand that a past challenge has ended while their body continues responding as though the threat remains present. This creates an interesting situation. The conscious mind says, I want something new. The deeper emotional system says, stay with what is familiar, even when the familiar is uncomfortable, because familiarity feels predictable, and predictability often feels safe. This means that one of the greatest obstacles to transformation may not be external limitations at all. It may be the unconscious attachment to patterns that once protected us, patterns that served a purpose in the past but no longer serve the future we hope to create. I have noticed this repeatedly in stories of remarkable personal change. The breakthrough rarely begins with acquiring more information. It begins with releasing an outdated identity. Someone stops seeing themselves as permanently limited. Someone stops defining themselves by a single painful chapter. Someone stops assuming that yesterday's circumstances determine tomorrow's possibilities. And in that moment, a new future becomes imaginable. The importance of imagination cannot be overstated. Not imagination as fantasy, not escapism, but imagination as the ability to mentally explore possibilities that do not yet exist. Every invention began as imagination. Every scientific breakthrough began as imagination. Every meaningful change in a person's life was imagined before it was experienced. The future enters reality through the doorway of imagination. Yet many adults gradually lose trust in this capacity. Children naturally imagine possibilities. Adults often focus on probabilities. Children ask what could happen. Adults become preoccupied with what usually happens. Neither perspective is entirely wrong. But when possibility disappears from our thinking, growth becomes constrained by existing conditions. And existing conditions are often poor predictors of future potential. History demonstrates this repeatedly. Entire fields of knowledge once considered impossible are now commonplace. Technologies that would have seemed miraculous a century ago fit comfortably inside our pockets. Human understanding expands because someone first entertains an idea beyond current assumptions. The same principle may apply to personal transformation. The version of ourselves we become tomorrow is not limited to the version we are today. That realization carries tremendous responsibility because it means we cannot simply wait for life to change us. We participate in the process through our attention, through our choices, through the meanings we assign to experience, through the emotional environments we cultivate within ourselves. Every day, whether we realize it or not, we are rehearsing a future. Our thoughts rehearse it. Our emotions rehearse it. Our behaviors rehearse it. Our expectations rehearse it. And over time, these repeated patterns begin influencing the trajectory of our lives, not with mechanical certainty, not through guaranteed outcomes, but through countless subtle interactions between consciousness and behavior. This perspective transforms manifestation from a passive process into an active one. It becomes less about wishing, less about waiting, less about hoping reality changes on its own, and more about becoming the kind of person capable of recognizing, engaging with, and creating new possibilities. The deeper I explore this idea, the more I suspect that human potential is far greater than we typically imagine, not because we possess supernatural abilities, but because we consistently underestimate the power of awareness itself. We underestimate the influence of perception. We underestimate the effects of emotional coherence. We underestimate the capacity of the human mind to reorganize itself through experience. And perhaps most importantly, we underestimate how dramatically our lives can change when our internal model of reality begins to evolve. Because once that internal model shifts, something remarkable starts to happen. The world that once appeared fixed begins revealing hidden layers. Challenges start looking different. Opportunities emerge from unexpected places. Connections become visible where none seemed to exist before. And what initially looked like a change in circumstances may actually be evidence of something much deeper unfolding within consciousness itself, a process that becomes even more intriguing when we begin examining the surprising relationship between focused attention, biological adaptation, and the mysterious way the human brain appears to reshape its own architecture in response to what we repeatedly choose to think, feel, and believe. I find that idea impossible to ignore. Because for a long time, many people believed the adult brain was largely fixed. The assumption was simple. Once we reached a certain age, our patterns became permanent, our habits hardened, our ways of thinking settled into place. But modern discoveries have challenged that assumption. The brain is far more adaptable than we once imagined. Neural pathways strengthen through repetition. New connections can emerge through experience. Patterns of attention can literally influence how certain networks become more dominant over time. When I first encountered this concept, it changed the way I viewed personal growth. Suddenly, transformation was no longer just a motivational idea. It became a biological process. Every thought may not alter the brain instantly. Every emotional experience may not create immediate change, but repeated patterns leave traces. Just as a path through a forest becomes clearer each time it is walked, mental and emotional pathways become more familiar through repetition. This realization raises an important question. If our brains are constantly adapting to what we repeatedly focus on, then what exactly are we training ourselves to notice every day? Some people spend years rehearsing fear, not intentionally, not because they want to, but because uncertainty repeatedly pulls their attention toward worst-case scenarios. Others rehearse resentment. Some rehearse self-doubt. Some rehearse limitation. And over time, those emotional and mental states begin to feel normal. The familiar becomes mistaken for the inevitable. But what happens when the rehearsal changes? What happens when attention begins moving toward possibility instead of limitation? What happens when gratitude becomes more than an occasional feeling and starts becoming a regular mental environment? What happens when curiosity becomes stronger than fear? What happens when we stop identifying with every thought that enters our awareness? These questions become especially important when we consider a remarkable feature of consciousness. We are capable of observing our own thinking. That may sound obvious, yet the more I reflect on it, the more extraordinary it becomes. A thought appears, and somehow we can become aware of the thought. An emotion arises. And somehow we can notice the emotion, a reaction begins, and somehow another part of us can witness the reaction. This ability creates a small but powerful space between stimulus and response. Within that space lives choice, not perfect control, not unlimited freedom, but choice. And sometimes that choice changes everything. A person feels fear but acts anyway. A person notices anger but chooses understanding. A person recognizes an old pattern and decides not to repeat it. These moments may seem insignificant, yet entire lives can shift because of them. Because every new choice introduces a new possibility, and every new possibility introduces a different future. The fascinating part is that this process often feels invisible while it's happening. When we look at someone's transformation from the outside, we tend to focus on the visible result. The successful business, the healthier body, the improved relationship, the creative achievement. But those outcomes are usually the final chapter of a much longer story. Behind them are countless unseen decisions. Moments when someone challenged an assumption. Moments when someone changed a habit. Moments when someone refused to surrender to an old identity. The external change was simply the visible expression of an internal evolution that had already been unfolding. This is one reason manifestation becomes much more interesting when viewed through the lens of consciousness rather than material outcomes. The true transformation is not necessarily what appears in the outer world. The true transformation is who we become in the process. Because even when circumstances improve, the deeper gift is often the expanded awareness that made those improvements possible. Without that internal shift, many external changes would never be sustained. I have often wondered why two people can encounter the same opportunity and respond completely differently. One person sees possibility, the other sees risk. One feels excitement, the other feels hesitation. One moves forward, the other remains where they are. The opportunity itself is identical. The interpretation is not. An interpretation may be one of the most powerful forces shaping human experience. Every moment, our minds are assigning meaning to events. A conversation, a setback, a coincidence, a challenge, a success. Meaning influences emotion. Emotion influences behavior. Behavior influences outcomes. Outcomes reinforce meaning. And the cycle continues. What fascinates me is that many of these meanings are not objective facts. They are stories. Stories we inherited. Stories we learned. Stories we repeated so often that they began feeling unquestionably true. But when a story changes, reality often begins changing with it. Consider someone who views failure as evidence of personal inadequacy. Every setback reinforces limitation. Now consider someone who views failure as information. The exact same event produces a completely different response. One story creates discouragement. The other creates learning. The event remains unchanged. The meaning transforms everything. Perhaps this is why inner transformation has occupied thinkers, philosophers, and researchers for generations. At some level, they all recognized a profound truth. Human beings do not merely experience reality. We experience our interpretation of reality. And while we cannot always control circumstances, we often possess far greater influence over interpretation than we realize. This does not mean ignoring difficulties. It does not mean pretending challenges do not exist. Real suffering exists. Real obstacles exist. Real uncertainty exists. But within those realities, consciousness still plays a role. The lens through which we view an experience can either narrow our possibilities or expand them. That insight becomes especially powerful during moments of uncertainty, because uncertainty is often where the future is being formed. When outcomes are unknown, the mind naturally searches for familiar references. It reaches into memory. It examines past experiences. It tries to predict what comes next. Yet the future is not always obligated to resemble the past. That may be one of the most liberating ideas available to us. The fact that something has happened before does not guarantee it will happen again. The fact that we have been a certain way does not require us to remain that way. The fact that a limitation once existed does not mean it must define the rest of our lives. Human beings are dynamic systems. We learn, we adapt, we evolve. And sometimes we evolve in ways that surprise even ourselves. The more I explore the relationship between belief, perception, biology, and awareness, the more I become convinced that manifestation is less about influencing the external world directly and more about creating the internal conditions from which new realities can emerge. Because when perception changes, choices change. When choices change, actions change. When actions change, experiences change. And over time, those experiences begin shaping a future that once seemed impossible. Yet there is another layer to this story that makes the entire picture even more intriguing. Because beyond thoughts, beyond emotions, beyond behavior itself, researchers are beginning to investigate something that sits at the center of every human experience: the quality of attention, and what happens when attention becomes so focused, so coherent, and so aligned that the usual boundaries between observer and experience begin to feel very different than we once assumed. That possibility invites us into one of the most fascinating frontiers of human experience, because attention is far more than simple concentration. Most of us think of attention as a mental flashlight. We point it towards something, and awareness follows. But the deeper I explored the science of perception and consciousness, the more I began to see attention as something closer to an architect. It helps construct the reality we experience. Not reality in its entirety, of course. The world exists independently of our individual wishes. Gravity does not disappear because we stop believing in it. Physical laws continue operating regardless of our opinions. Yet within that larger reality, attention determines which pieces become part of our conscious experience. And that distinction matters. Imagine standing in the middle of a vast library containing millions of books. Everything is present. Everything exists. But the few books you choose to open will shape your understanding of the library. In many ways, consciousness functions similarly. Every day we are surrounded by an overwhelming amount of information. Our attention selects a tiny portion. That selected portion becomes our lived experience. This means that attention is not merely observing reality. It is participating in the creation of our personal version of reality. And once I began viewing it through that lens, I started noticing something remarkable. The quality of attention matters just as much as its direction. Scattered attention produces one experience. Focused attention produces another. Fearful attention produces one set of perceptions. Curious attention produces another. The same environment can generate entirely different experiences depending on the state of awareness brought to it. This becomes especially important when we think about emotional energy. Not energy in a mystical sense, but energy as the measurable vitality, motivation, and psychological momentum that influence human behavior. We've all experienced days when everything feels heavy. Simple tasks seem difficult. Creative thinking feels distant. Possibilities appear limited. Then there are other days when the exact same circumstances feel completely different. Ideas flow naturally. Challenges feel manageable. Solutions appear where obstacles once stood. What changed? Often, it wasn't the environment. It was our internal state. Our emotional condition altered the way we interacted with reality. This observation appears repeatedly throughout studies of performance, creativity, resilience, and well-being. Human beings function differently under different emotional conditions. We perceive differently, think differently, remember differently, act differently, which means that emotional states are not merely reactions to life. They are active participants in shaping it. The implications of this are profound. Because many of us spend years waiting for circumstances to improve before allowing ourselves to experience positive emotional states. We tell ourselves, I'll feel confident when I succeed. I'll feel peaceful when everything is resolved. I'll feel grateful when I finally get what I want. But what if the sequence is often reversed? What if certain emotional states help create the conditions that support those outcomes in the first place? Not because emotions magically control reality, because emotions influence behavior, and behavior influences results. A person operating from confidence takes actions that fear often prevents. A person operating from curiosity notices opportunities that anxiety may overlook. A person operating from gratitude often develops a relationship with life that supports resilience during uncertainty. The emotional state becomes part of the process. And this brings us to a subtle but powerful distinction. Many people attempt to change their lives by focusing exclusively on outcomes. They become obsessed with future results. The promotion, the relationship, the achievement, the destination. But consciousness seems to respond differently. The deepest transformations often emerge when attention shifts from acquiring outcomes to embodying qualities. Instead of asking, how do I get what I want? The question becomes, who am I becoming? That question changes everything because it redirects attention toward the present moment, toward habits, toward awareness, toward character, toward the internal conditions from which future outcomes naturally emerge. I have noticed that some of the most inspiring individuals throughout history seem to understand this principle intuitively. They were not merely pursuing goals. They were cultivating states of being, discipline, patience, vision, compassion, resilience. These qualities became foundations upon which achievements were built. And perhaps that is why lasting transformation often feels different from temporary motivation. Motivation is frequently tied to external circumstances. Transformation is rooted in identity. Motivation says, I want to do something. Transformation says, I am becoming someone. When identity changes, behavior often follows naturally. This may explain why profound personal growth can sometimes feel less like adding something new and more like uncovering something that was already present. Many people describe transformative experiences in surprisingly similar ways. They speak of clarity, alignment, a sense of remembering rather than learning. As though beneath layers of conditioning, expectation, and habit, there existed a deeper dimension of themselves waiting to be recognized. Whether viewed through psychology, neuroscience, or philosophy, this idea continues appearing in different forms. Human beings possess capacities that often remain dormant until circumstances invite them forward. Strength appears during adversity. Creativity emerges during uncertainty. Wisdom develops through reflection. Potential reveals itself through engagement. The capability was always present. The conditions simply allowed it to surface. And that perspective changes the way I think about manifestation entirely. Rather than asking how we can force reality to conform to our desires, perhaps a more meaningful question is this: what conditions allow our highest potential to emerge? Because when those conditions are present, remarkable things often happen. Not overnight, not instantly, but consistently. Awareness expands, perception sharpens, behavior evolves, relationships deepen, purpose becomes clearer. And gradually, the external world begins reflecting the internal changes taking place. This process is rarely dramatic while it unfolds. Most transformations occur quietly. A new habit formed today. A limiting belief questioned tomorrow. A different response chosen next week. Months later, an entirely different life begins taking shape. Looking back, it appears sudden. Living through it, it felt almost invisible. Perhaps that is why so many of life's most important changes are overlooked. We search for grand moments. Meanwhile, transformation often arrives through small decisions repeated consistently over time. Decision by decision, thought by thought, moment by moment, until one day we realize we are seeing the world through a completely different lens than before. And that realization points toward a deeper mystery still. Because if awareness can evolve, if perception can expand, if human potential can emerge in ways that continually surprise us, then perhaps consciousness itself is far less understood than we currently believe. Perhaps what we call manifestation is merely one visible expression of a much larger process, an ongoing relationship between mind, body, emotion, attention, and the extraordinary capacity of human beings to participate in their own evolution. And once we begin exploring that possibility seriously, another question naturally emerges, a question that may challenge some of our most fundamental assumptions about reality itself, because it invites us to examine whether consciousness is simply something we possess or whether it may play a far more central role in human experience than we have ever imagined, that question has followed me for years. Not because it offers easy answers, but because it changes the way I look at almost every aspect of human experience. For a long time, consciousness was treated as something obvious. We wake up, we think, we feel, we perceive. The experience is so familiar that we rarely stop to examine it. Yet when we look closely, awareness becomes one of the greatest mysteries we encounter. How does subjective experience arise? How does a collection of biological processes create the feeling of being you? How does matter become meaning? The more deeply researchers investigate these questions, the more fascinating they become. And while science continues exploring the mechanisms of consciousness, there is another observation that feels equally important. Consciousness is not static. It changes, not only across years and decades, but from moment to moment. The person I am when consumed by stress is not experiencing the world in the same way as the person I am when deeply present. The facts of reality may remain unchanged, yet the experience of reality can be dramatically different. This realization reveals something profound. Much of what we call reality is filtered through the quality of awareness itself. When awareness is fragmented, life often feels fragmented. When awareness is clear, life often appears clearer. The external world has not necessarily transformed. The lens through which it is being experienced has. I think this is why practices that cultivate self-awareness have persisted across cultures for thousands of years. Long before brain imaging technologies existed, people recognized that attention could be trained, awareness could be refined, perception could become more precise. Today, modern research continues uncovering evidence that focused awareness influences stress responses, emotional regulation, cognitive performance, and even physical well-being. Different language, different methods, yet often pointing toward a similar insight. The state of consciousness matters, perhaps far more than we once realized. What fascinates me most is what happens when awareness becomes less reactive. Most people spend much of their lives responding automatically. A situation occurs, an emotion appears, a familiar pattern activates. The reaction follows. The process is so fast that it feels inevitable. But when awareness deepens, something interesting begins to happen. The reaction becomes visible. Instead of being completely absorbed by it, we can observe it. The fear becomes noticeable. The assumption becomes noticeable. The habit becomes noticeable. And once something becomes visible, it becomes possible to change our relationship with it. That may sound simple, yet it represents one of the most powerful capacities available to human beings. Because unconscious patterns can guide an entire lifetime. Patterns inherited from childhood, patterns learned through experience, patterns reinforced by repetition. Many of these patterns operate beneath conscious awareness. They quietly influence decisions, relationships, ambitions, and beliefs. Then one day, awareness shines a light on them, and everything begins to look different. I have often noticed that transformative moments are rarely about discovering entirely new information. More often, they involve seeing familiar things in a new way. The facts may remain the same. The perspective changes, and perspective can alter the meaning of an entire life. Consider two people looking at the same challenge. One sees evidence of limitation. The other sees an opportunity for growth. The challenge itself remains unchanged, but the experience of it becomes completely different. The difference lies not in circumstance, but in consciousness. This is where the conversation about manifestation begins intersecting with something deeper than outcomes. It begins touching identity itself. Because the way we perceive the world is intimately connected to the way we perceive ourselves. If I believe I am powerless, I interpret events through that lens. If I believe I am capable of learning, adapting, and growing, I interpret those same events differently. Identity shapes perception. Perception shapes behavior. Behavior shapes experience. Experience reinforces identity, and the cycle continues unless awareness interrupts it. That interruption is where transformation often begins. A person realizes they are not identical to every thought they think, not identical to every emotion they feel, not identical to every story they have inherited. Suddenly there is space, and within that space, new possibilities emerge. I find this especially important because many people unknowingly carry identities formed by circumstances that no longer exist. A difficult experience from years ago becomes part of how they define themselves. A past disappointment becomes evidence of future limitation. An old failure becomes a permanent label. Yet, human beings are far more dynamic than the stories they tell about themselves. We are continually changing. Our cells change. Our beliefs change. Our understanding changes. Our capabilities change. And perhaps one of the greatest acts of growth is allowing our identity to evolve alongside that change. When we resist evolution, we often remain loyal to versions of ourselves that no longer reflect reality. We continue acting from outdated assumptions. We continue expecting familiar outcomes. We continue recreating experiences that match old beliefs, not because they are true, because they are familiar. This is why awareness can be so transformative. Awareness reveals the difference between what is real and what is merely habitual. And once that distinction becomes clear, new choices become available. The future begins opening in unexpected directions. What interests me even more is how this process influences collective human experience. We often think of transformation as an individual journey, but consciousness does not exist in isolation. Every interaction influences others. Every emotional state affects the environment around us. Every belief contributes to the collective narratives that shape culture. In that sense, personal growth extends beyond the individual. A person who becomes more patient changes conversations. A person who becomes more compassionate changes relationships. A person who becomes more aware changes the quality of attention they bring into every interaction. The effects ripple outward, often in ways impossible to measure. This reminds me that manifestation, when viewed through a broader lens, may not be primarily about acquiring things at all. It may be about contribution, about participation, about the qualities we bring into the world. Because ultimately, the most meaningful changes often involve more than personal achievement. They involve how our transformation influences the lives of others. The calm we cultivate becomes calm others experience. The understanding we develop becomes understanding we share. The resilience we build becomes resilience that inspires. And perhaps that is where the deepest expression of human potential begins to reveal itself. Not in controlling reality, not in manipulating outcomes, but in consciously participating in the unfolding of our lives with greater awareness, greater intention, and greater coherence. The more I reflect on this, the more I suspect that the future of human development may depend less on discovering entirely new capacities and more on understanding capacities we already possess. The capacity for awareness, the capacity for adaptation, the capacity for imagination, the capacity for emotional intelligence, the capacity for conscious choice. These abilities have been present all along, yet many remain underutilized, not because they are unavailable, because they require attention to develop, and attention, perhaps more than anything else, appears to be the doorway through which human potential enters experience, which leads to an even more intriguing possibility. If attention shapes perception, perception shapes behavior, behavior shapes reality, and consciousness can deliberately influence attention itself, then we may be standing at the edge of a much larger understanding of what it means to be human. An understanding that invites us to explore not merely how reality affects consciousness, but whether consciousness, in ways we are only beginning to understand, may be participating in reality far more deeply than conventional thinking has ever allowed. The deeper I contemplate that possibility, the more I realize how often we underestimate the role of participation in our lives. Many of us grow up believing that reality simply happens to us. Events occur. Circumstances unfold. Opportunities appear or disappear. And our role is primarily to react. There is some truth in that perspective. None of us control every variable. We cannot dictate every event, predict every outcome, or eliminate uncertainty from life. Yet there is another side to the story. While we may not control everything that happens, we continuously influence how we engage with what happens, and that influence is far more powerful than it first appears. Imagine two people standing before the same challenge. Both possess similar resources. Both face similar obstacles. Yet one gradually discovers possibilities while the other sees only barriers. Years later, their lives look remarkably different. Why? The answer rarely lies in a single event. More often, it lies in thousands of small interactions between consciousness and circumstance. Tiny choices, tiny perceptions, tiny responses, repeated consistently over time. These subtle differences accumulate, and accumulation is one of the most underestimated forces in human development. A single thought may seem insignificant. A single decision may appear trivial. A single moment of awareness may feel unimportant. But lives are not built from isolated moments. They are built from patterns. And patterns become powerful through repetition. This realization changed the way I think about transformation. Instead of searching for one dramatic breakthrough, I began paying attention to the smaller processes happening beneath the surface. How do I respond to uncertainty? How do I interpret setbacks? What assumptions guide my attention? What emotional states dominate my daily experience? These questions may seem ordinary, yet they reveal the architecture from which our futures emerge. Because every day, consciously or unconsciously, we are reinforcing certain pathways. We are strengthening certain beliefs. We are rehearsing certain emotional states. We are practicing specific ways of relating to reality. And eventually, those practices become our normal experience. The fascinating part is that the brain appears designed for this process. It learns from repetition. It adapts to patterns. It becomes efficient at whatever it does most often. This is incredibly useful when developing skills. A musician practices until movements become natural. An athlete trains until reactions become automatic. A language learner repeats patterns until communication becomes effortless. But the same principle applies beyond physical skills. It applies to thought patterns, emotional habits, perceptual filters, ways of interpreting experience. In other words, we become familiar with the realities we repeatedly rehearse. And familiarity is powerful. The human nervous system often prefers familiar discomfort over unfamiliar possibility. Not because possibility is undesirable, because uncertainty can feel threatening. This explains why genuine transformation sometimes feels uncomfortable even when it is positive. A new opportunity can create anxiety. A healthier relationship can feel unfamiliar. A larger vision can trigger self-doubt. Growth challenges the known. And the known has a powerful pull. I think this is one reason so many people abandon meaningful change just before breakthroughs occur. Not because they lack ability, not because success is impossible, but because the transition between old and new identities can feel disorienting. The familiar self begins dissolving. The future self has not fully emerged. There is a space between them, a period of uncertainty, a period where external evidence may be limited, a period where faith in the process becomes important, not blind faith, but trust built upon observation, effort, and experience. Because transformation rarely unfolds in a straight line. There are advances and setbacks, moments of clarity and moments of confusion, periods of momentum and periods of apparent stagnation. Yet beneath all of it, development continues. Much like a river carving a canyon, significant change often occurs gradually enough that we fail to notice it while it is happening. Only later do we recognize how much has shifted. This perspective becomes especially meaningful when considering human potential. We often evaluate ourselves based on current results, current circumstances, current capabilities. But potential exists beyond the present moment. By definition, it represents capacities not yet fully expressed. The challenge is that potential is difficult to measure. We can easily observe what exists. We cannot easily observe what has not yet emerged. And because of that, many people underestimate themselves. They confuse their present condition with their ultimate capacity. They assume today's limitations define tomorrow's possibilities. History repeatedly demonstrates otherwise. Individuals exceed expectations. Communities overcome enormous obstacles. Innovations emerge from places where no one anticipated them. Again and again, reality reveals that potential is often larger than prediction. The same may be true within each of us. There may be abilities, insights, strengths, and creative capacities waiting beneath the surface of ordinary awareness, not hidden in a mystical sense, simply undeveloped, unpracticed, unrecognized. Like muscles that strengthen through use, many human capacities expand through engagement. Attention strengthens through practice. Resilience strengthens through challenge. Wisdom strengthens through reflection. Compassion strengthens through connection. The more we engage these capacities, the more available they become. And perhaps this is where manifestation takes on its most practical meaning. Not as a process of wishing for outcomes, not as an attempt to bypass effort or reality, but as a deliberate cultivation of the internal conditions that allow potential to emerge. When awareness becomes clearer, perception changes. When perception changes, choices change. When choices change, behavior changes. When behavior changes, new realities become possible. The process is both simple and profound. Simple because the principles are understandable. Profound because their long-term effects can be extraordinary. What fascinates me most is that this process appears available to everyone, regardless of background, regardless of circumstance, regardless of where the journey begins. Every person possesses the ability to direct attention, to question assumptions, to learn, to adapt, to evolve. The pace may differ, the path may differ, the outcomes may differ, but the capacity remains, and that capacity points towards something larger than personal achievement. It points toward the possibility that consciousness itself is an evolving phenomenon, not merely a passive observer of life, but an active participant in development, a dynamic force capable of learning, reorganizing, and expanding through experience. If that is true, then every challenge becomes more than an obstacle. It becomes information. Every setback becomes feedback. Every success becomes evidence. Every moment becomes part of a larger process through which awareness continually refines itself. And when viewed from that perspective, life begins to feel less like a series of disconnected events and more like an ongoing dialogue between consciousness and experience. A dialogue that may ultimately reveal that the greatest manifestation is not the creation of external results at all, but the gradual emergence of a more aware, more coherent, and more fully realized version of ourselves, a process whose implications become even more astonishing when we begin exploring how collective consciousness, shared beliefs, and interconnected human systems might influence the future of our species in ways we are only beginning to recognize. That possibility opens an entirely new dimension of the conversation, because until now, much of our exploration has focused on the individual, the relationship between personal consciousness, perception, belief, emotion, and behavior. Yet human beings do not exist in isolation. From the moment we are born, we are immersed in networks of influence, families, communities, cultures, languages, ideas, stories. Every one of these shapes the way we interpret reality. And just as individuals develop beliefs about what is possible, groups develop beliefs as well. Entire societies can become organized around assumptions so familiar that they are rarely questioned. Assumptions about success, about limitation, about identity, about human nature itself. What fascinates me is how powerfully collective beliefs can influence individual experience. Consider something as simple as expectation. If a child grows up surrounded by people who consistently reinforce the idea that growth is possible, that learning is valuable, and that challenges can be overcome, those expectations often become woven into the child's worldview. The opposite is also true. When limitations are repeated often enough, they can begin to feel like facts. And this reveals something important. Many of the boundaries we encounter are not physical. They are conceptual. They exist in the stories we inherit and the assumptions we accept. Of course, physical realities matter. Circumstances matter. Resources matter. But human history repeatedly shows that some of the greatest transformations begin when people question assumptions that once seemed permanent. For centuries, certain ideas about what was possible appeared unquestionable. Then someone challenged them. A new perspective emerged, and the boundaries shifted. This process happens not only in science and technology, but also in personal development. Every meaningful transformation begins with a disruption of an old story. A story about who we are. A story about what can happen. A story about what the future might hold. The moment that story changes, new possibilities begin entering awareness. And awareness, as we've seen again and again, is often where transformation begins. What becomes especially interesting is the way human beings influence one another's consciousness. Emotions spread, attitudes spread, beliefs spread, hope spreads, fear spreads. Anyone who has entered a room filled with tension has felt this phenomenon. No words are required. The atmosphere communicates something. Likewise, anyone who has spent time with deeply optimistic, creative, or resilient individuals knows how contagious those qualities can be. We affect one another constantly, sometimes subtly, sometimes profoundly. This interconnected nature of human experience suggests that personal transformation may have consequences far beyond the individual. Every time someone becomes more aware, they change the quality of interactions around them. Every time someone responds with patience instead of reactivity, a different possibility enters the environment. Every time someone challenges a limiting belief, they make it easier for others to do the same. The effects ripple outward, often invisibly, yet powerfully. I find this perspective deeply encouraging because it reminds me that growth is never solely personal. The work we do within ourselves contributes to something larger. A parent who develops greater emotional awareness influences future generations. A teacher who believes in human potential influences countless students. A leader who embodies integrity influences entire communities. The impact extends beyond what we can directly observe. And perhaps that is one of the most overlooked aspects of manifestation. We tend to think about what we want to receive, but what if an equally important question is what we are contributing? What qualities are we bringing into the world? What emotional environments are we creating? What possibilities are we helping others see? These questions shift the focus from acquisition to participation. And participation changes everything. Because when we begin viewing ourselves as active participants in an interconnected system, our choices take on new significance. A single act of kindness is no longer insignificant. A single moment of courage is no longer isolated. A single decision to grow rather than retreat becomes part of a larger pattern influencing both ourselves and others. This perspective also challenges one of the most persistent illusions in modern life, the illusion of separation. We often imagine ourselves as completely independent individuals moving through the world alone. Yet our experiences suggest something different. We are constantly shaped by relationships, by conversations, by shared ideas, by emotional exchanges. Our consciousness develops through connection. And perhaps our highest potential does as well. The more I reflect on this, the more I wonder whether human evolution is not simply biological. Perhaps it is also psychological, emotional, cultural, even conscious. Generation after generation, knowledge accumulates. Understanding expands, new perspectives emerge, humanity learns, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but learning occurs. And that learning changes what becomes possible. A person born today has access to insights, discoveries, and information that would have been unimaginable centuries ago. The collective understanding of humanity continues evolving. The question is whether our consciousness evolves alongside it. Because knowledge alone does not guarantee wisdom. Information alone does not guarantee understanding. Technological advancement alone does not guarantee human flourishing. Something else is required. Awareness. discernment, the ability to integrate knowledge into meaningful experience. Without those qualities, information can overwhelm rather than empower. This is why inner development remains so important. As our external capabilities grow, the need for self-awareness grows with them. The greater our power to influence the world, the greater our responsibility to understand ourselves. And perhaps this is where the conversation about manifestation reaches its deepest level. Not as a technique, not as a formula, but as an invitation to examine the relationship between consciousness and creation. Every human being creates. We create ideas. We create relationships. We create cultures. We create futures through the choices we make today. The question is not whether we are creating. The question is whether we are creating consciously. Are we acting from awareness or habit? From intention or reaction? From possibility or limitation? These questions may ultimately matter more than any specific outcome, because the quality of consciousness from which action emerges often determines the quality of what is created. And when enough individuals begin asking these questions, collective transformation becomes possible, not through force, not through ideology, but through gradual shifts in awareness. One person becomes more conscious, then another, then another. New conversations emerge, new perspectives spread, new possibilities become visible, and slowly the boundaries of what humanity believes is possible begin to expand. When I consider the future from this perspective, I feel a sense of cautious optimism, not because challenges will disappear, not because uncertainty will end, but because human beings possess extraordinary capacities for adaptation, creativity, and growth. Again and again, history reveals our ability to transcend limitations once thought permanent. The same potential exists within consciousness itself. And if that potential continues unfolding, we may discover that some of the most important frontiers of the future are not located in distant places or advanced technologies, but within the untapped dimensions of human awareness, a frontier that invites one final and perhaps most profound question of all. If consciousness can continuously evolve, expand, and transform throughout a lifetime, then what might become possible when individuals learn not merely to change their circumstances, but to consciously participate in the ongoing evolution of awareness itself? That question lingers in my mind because it shifts the focus from achievement to evolution. For much of our lives, we are taught to measure success through external markers, accomplishments, status, recognition, possessions, milestones. These things can be meaningful, and many of them reflect genuine effort and growth. Yet when I look closely at the moments that transform me most deeply, they rarely involved acquiring something new. They involved seeing something differently, a new understanding, a new perspective, a new relationship with myself and the world around me. Those moments changed the direction of my life far more than any external achievement ever could. Perhaps that is because awareness operates at the source. It influences how we interpret every experience that follows. Imagine looking through a window covered with dust. The landscape outside may be beautiful, but the view remains distorted. Cleaning the window does not change the landscape. It changes the clarity with which we perceive it. In many ways, consciousness works similarly. The clearer our awareness becomes, the more accurately we can engage with reality. Not reality as we fear it might be, not reality as we wish it would be, but reality as it actually is. And there is immense power in that, because genuine transformation does not require denying reality. It requires seeing reality clearly enough to respond effectively. This is where manifestation in its most grounded form becomes deeply practical. The process is not about escaping reality. It is about developing the awareness necessary to work with reality more skillfully. A person who understands their emotional patterns can navigate challenges more effectively. A person who recognizes limiting assumptions can make different choices. A person who cultivates clarity can identify opportunities that confusion might obscure. Awareness becomes an advantage, not because it grants supernatural abilities, because it improves our relationship with experience itself. What fascinates me is how often profound change begins with observation. Before a habit changes, it is observed. Before a belief changes, It is questioned. Before a pattern changes, it becomes visible. Awareness comes first. Action follows. And this sequence appears repeatedly across nearly every form of human development. Athletes study performance. Scientists observe phenomena. Artists observe details others overlook. Leaders observe systems and relationships. Growth begins with seeing. The challenge, of course, is that observation requires honesty, and honesty can be uncomfortable. Sometimes awareness reveals strengths we have ignored. Other times it reveals fears we have avoided. Old assumptions, unresolved emotions, patterns we would rather not acknowledge, yet these discoveries are often the very doorway to transformation, because what remains unconscious tends to remain unchanged. What becomes conscious becomes workable. The moment we see a pattern clearly, we gain the opportunity to respond differently. That opportunity may be one of the greatest gifts consciousness offers: the ability to interrupt automatic cycles, the ability to choose, the ability to evolve. And evolution, when viewed through this lens, is not a destination. It is an ongoing process, a continual refinement of awareness, a continual expansion of understanding, a continual deepening of our relationship with reality. This perspective removes much of the pressure people often place on themselves. There is no final state of perfection to achieve, no ultimate version of ourselves that eliminates all uncertainty. Human growth appears less like arriving at a destination and more like participating in a journey. Each stage reveals new questions. Each insight opens new possibilities. Each level of awareness uncovers dimensions previously unseen. The process itself becomes meaningful. In fact, I sometimes wonder whether one of the greatest misconceptions about personal development is the belief that growth should eventually end, that one day we will finally arrive, finally understand everything, finally eliminate all limitations. Yet life seems to suggest something different. Growth continues as long as curiosity remains alive. Awareness continues expanding as long as we remain willing to learn. Potential continues unfolding as long as we continue engaging with it. This realization transforms uncertainty. Instead of viewing uncertainty as a problem, we begin seeing it as a condition of possibility. After all, if everything were already known, nothing new could emerge. Every discovery depends on uncertainty. Every innovation depends on uncertainty. Every transformation depends on uncertainty. The unknown is not merely a source of risk. It is also the birthplace of possibility. And perhaps that is why some of the most significant moments in life arrive unexpectedly. A conversation changes our perspective. A challenge reveals hidden strength. An idea opens a new path. A setback redirects us towards something greater. In hindsight, these moments often appear connected. Yet while living through them, they felt uncertain. The future was invisible. Only later did the pattern become clear. This reminds me that consciousness does not merely help us shape the future. It also helps us recognize meaning within experience. Human beings are natural meaning makers. We constantly search for patterns, relationships, and significance. Sometimes this tendency misleads us, but often it helps us navigate complexity. It allows us to transform experience into wisdom, and wisdom may be one of the most valuable manifestations of all. Unlike possessions, wisdom cannot be lost easily. Unlike circumstances, it travels with us. It informs decisions, guides actions, shapes relationships, expands perspective. The accumulation of wisdom gradually changes how we move through the world. And wisdom emerges not only from success, but from experience itself. Challenges contribute to it. Mistakes contribute to it. Reflection contributes to it. Awareness transforms experience into understanding. Understanding transforms knowledge into wisdom, and wisdom transforms the quality of our participation in life. The more I consider this process, the more I suspect that human potential is far less about becoming something entirely different and far more about becoming more fully ourselves. Not the conditioned self built entirely from habit and expectation, but the deeper self, capable of awareness, creativity, resilience, compassion, and growth. The self that emerges when perception becomes clearer, when fear loosens its grip, when possibility becomes visible, when attention aligns with intention. Perhaps manifestation is not ultimately about attracting something from outside ourselves. Perhaps it is about removing the barriers that prevent our existing potential from expressing itself, the barriers of distraction, the barriers of limitation, the barriers of unconscious patterns. As those barriers begin to dissolve, something remarkable often happens. Life becomes less reactive, more intentional, less fragmented, more coherent, less driven by circumstance, more guided by awareness. And in that shift, we begin to recognize a truth that has been quietly present throughout this entire exploration, that consciousness may not be a passive observer carried along by life's currents, but an active participant capable of learning, adapting, creating meaning, and evolving in partnership with experience, a realization that points toward an even deeper mystery, one that challenges us to consider what future generations might discover about the untapped capacities of the human mind as the exploration of consciousness continues to unfold. When I think about that future, I am struck by how early we may still be in our understanding of consciousness. Humanity has mapped continents, explored oceans, decoded portions of our genetic blueprint, and built technologies that connect billions of people across the planet. Yet the experience through which all of these discoveries occur, the experience of awareness itself, remains one of the least understood aspects of existence. That realization fills me with a sense of wonder, because it suggests that some of the greatest discoveries ahead may not involve distant places at all. They may involve a deeper understanding of ourselves, not merely who we are, but what we are capable of becoming. Throughout history, there have been moments when accepted assumptions suddenly expanded. The Earth was once believed to occupy the center of everything. Later discoveries transformed that understanding. There was a time when flight seemed impossible. Then it became ordinary. Again and again, human knowledge has advanced by questioning limitations that once appeared absolute. Perhaps consciousness represents another frontier of that kind, not because it will reveal magical powers or eliminate the challenges of life, but because a deeper understanding of awareness could fundamentally change how we approach learning, health, creativity, relationships, and human development itself. Already, researchers continue uncovering evidence that the brain remains adaptable throughout life. That attention can be trained, that emotional regulation can be strengthened. That perception influences behavior in powerful ways. These discoveries point toward an encouraging possibility. Human beings may be far more flexible than we once believed, not fixed, not finished, not confined to static identities, but continuously capable of adaptation. I find that idea especially important in a world that often encourages rigid labels. People frequently define themselves by a single chapter, a past failure, a difficult experience, a current circumstance, an old belief, yet no single chapter defines an entire story. The person we are today is not necessarily the person we will be tomorrow. Every experience contains the potential to reshape understanding. Every insight has the potential to redirect a life. And every moment of awareness creates an opportunity for change. This perspective transforms the way I think about potential. Potential is not something we either possess or lack. It is something we develop, something we uncover, something we engage with through action, reflection, and experience. A seed contains potential, yet that potential emerges only under certain conditions. Light, water, time, growth. Human potential seems remarkably similar. The capacity may already exist, but its expression depends on the environment we create within ourselves and around us. This is where responsibility enters the conversation. Because if consciousness influences perception and perception influences behavior, then the quality of our inner environment matters. The thoughts we rehearse matter. The emotions we cultivate matter. The beliefs we reinforce matter. not because they magically determine reality, because they shape the lens through which reality is experienced and engaged. That lens influences every decision we make, and decisions accumulated over time become destiny. Not in a predetermined sense, but in the sense that today's choices contribute to tomorrow's possibilities. The future does not emerge from nowhere. It grows from countless interactions occurring in the present moment. This is why awareness remains so central. Awareness allows us to participate consciously in that process. Without awareness, patterns repeat automatically. With awareness, patterns become choices, and choices create new pathways. I sometimes imagine consciousness as a vast landscape with regions most of us have barely explored. Not hidden because they are inaccessible, hidden because our attention rarely travels there. Areas of creativity waiting to emerge, areas of resilience waiting to be discovered, areas of insight waiting to become visible. Many of these capacities reveal themselves only when circumstances call them forward. A challenge uncovers courage. Responsibility uncovers leadership. Adversity uncovers resilience. Connection uncovers compassion. The qualities were present all along. Experience simply created the conditions for their expression. This observation suggests something profound. Perhaps we are often more than we realize before life asks us to become it. The future version of ourselves already exists as potential, not fully formed, not predetermined, but present as possibility. Every choice either nurtures that possibility or neglects it. Every act of awareness helps bring it into clearer focus. And over time, what was once potential becomes reality. This gradual emergence seems to be one of the defining characteristics of growth. Rarely dramatic in a single moment, often extraordinary when viewed across years. Looking back, many people can identify periods when they changed profoundly. At the time, the changes felt small, a new habit, a new perspective, a different response. Only later did they recognize how transformative those shifts had been. This reminds me that transformation is often easier to recognize in retrospect than in real time. When we are living through it, progress can appear invisible. Yet invisible does not mean absent. Roots grow before branches appear. Foundations form before structures rise. Awareness develops before behavior changes. Behavior changes before circumstances reflect those changes. Patience becomes essential. Not passive patience, active patience. The willingness to continue cultivating growth even when immediate evidence is limited. This may be one of the most important lessons hidden within the broader conversation about manifestation. The deepest changes often begin beneath the surface. Before outcomes, before recognition, before visible results, something shifts internally. A new understanding emerges. A new identity begins forming. A new relationship with possibility develops. Then gradually the external world starts reflecting those changes. Not perfectly, not instantly, but meaningfully. The process is less about controlling reality and more about aligning ourselves with our highest capacities for awareness and action. And perhaps that distinction changes everything because it places the focus where our greatest influence exists. Not on forcing outcomes, not on eliminating uncertainty, but on cultivating the qualities that allow us to respond wisely, creatively, and effectively to whatever life presents. The more I reflect on this, the more I believe that consciousness may ultimately be humanity's most valuable resource. Not because it provides all the answers, but because it is the medium through which every answer is sought. Every discovery begins in awareness. Every innovation begins in awareness. Every act of compassion, creativity, learning, and transformation begins in awareness. Which means that understanding consciousness is not merely an intellectual pursuit, it is an exploration of the very foundation of human experience. And as that exploration continues, through science, observation, reflection, and lived experience, we may find ourselves uncovering possibilities that have been present all along, quietly waiting at the edge of perception, waiting for humanity to ask deeper questions about who we are, what we can become, and how the evolution of consciousness itself may shape the next chapter of our collective journey into the unknown. The more I think about that journey into the unknown, the more I realize that some of the most important discoveries do not arrive as answers. They arrive as better questions. Questions have a unique power. A belief can close a door. A question can open one. A conclusion can end exploration. A question can begin it. And throughout history, many of humanity's greatest breakthroughs began with someone willing to ask a question that others overlooked. What if there is another way? What if our assumptions are incomplete? What if reality is more complex than it appears? Those questions have driven scientific revolutions, technological advancements, and profound shifts in human understanding. Yet they are equally valuable in our personal lives. Because transformation often begins when we question ideas we once accepted without examination. What if I am capable of more than I assume? What if this limitation is not permanent? What if my current perspective is only one of many possible perspectives? Questions like these create space, and space is where growth occurs. Without space, consciousness becomes trapped inside familiar patterns. With space, new possibilities emerge. I find it fascinating that the human mind often treats uncertainty as something to avoid. We seek certainty because certainty feels safe, predictable, comfortable. Yet certainty can also become restrictive. It can lock us into outdated interpretations. It can convince us that the future must resemble the past. It can prevent us from noticing opportunities that exist beyond our current expectations. In contrast, curiosity invites exploration. And exploration is essential for evolution. Every meaningful development in life requires stepping beyond what is already known. A child learning to walk enters uncertainty. An entrepreneur starting a business enters uncertainty. A scientist investigating a new idea enters uncertainty. An individual transforming their life enters uncertainty. Growth and uncertainty appear to be inseparable companions. This observation changes the way I think about fear. For many years, I assumed fear was simply an obstacle, something to overcome, something to eliminate. But experience has taught me something different. Fear often appears whenever we approach the edge of the familiar, whenever we move towards something meaningful, whenever we enter territory where outcomes are unknown. In that sense, fear is not always evidence that we are moving in the wrong direction. Sometimes it is evidence that we are expanding beyond previous limitations. The challenge is learning how to distinguish between fear that protects us and fear that constrains us. That distinction requires awareness. Again, awareness returns to the center of the conversation, not as a concept, as a practice. A way of engaging with experience, a way of observing our thoughts without becoming trapped by them, a way of recognizing emotions without being controlled by them, a way of navigating complexity with greater clarity. The more I explore consciousness, the more I suspect that awareness functions much like a compass. It does not eliminate storms. It does not flatten mountains. It does not remove obstacles. What it does is help us orient ourselves within them. And orientation matters because the same challenge can produce very different outcomes depending on how we approach it. A setback can become discouragement, or it can become information. A failure can become an identity, or it can become a lesson. A period of uncertainty can become paralysis, or it can become preparation. The event remains the same. Consciousness influences the interpretation. Interpretation influences the response. Response influences the future. This sequence may seem simple, but its implications are enormous. It suggests that our relationship with experience may be just as important as the experience itself. Consider two people facing identical circumstances. One becomes consumed by resentment. The other develops resilience. One becomes trapped by the event. The other grows through it. Again, the difference often lies not in the circumstance, but in the meaning assigned to it. Meaning is one of the most powerful forces in human life. People can endure extraordinary challenges when those challenges possess meaning. Without meaning, even minor difficulties can feel overwhelming. This is why purpose matters. Not because purpose guarantees success, because purpose organizes attention. It provides direction. It creates coherence. It helps us determine which possibilities deserve our energy. And energy, like attention, is finite. Every day we are deciding where to invest it. Into growth or stagnation, into fear or curiosity, into reaction or intention. Those investments accumulate over time. They shape habits. They shape identities. They shape futures. When viewed from this perspective, manifestation becomes less about attracting experiences and more about directing attention and energy toward what matters most. The focus shifts from outcomes to alignment, from wishing to participation, from passive expectation to conscious engagement. I believe this shift is crucial because it restores agency, not total control. Agency, there is an important difference. Control suggests mastery over every variable. Agency recognizes our capacity to influence what we can influence. Our thoughts, our actions, our responses, our habits, our awareness. These may seem like small domains compared to the vast complexity of life. Yet they are precisely where meaningful change begins. Every significant transformation ultimately emerges through choices made within those domains. And when enough of those choices align with a clear vision, remarkable things become possible. Not because the universe suddenly changes its rules, because human beings begin expressing capacities that were previously dormant. Confidence emerges through action. Wisdom emerges through reflection. Strength emerges through challenge. Potential emerges through engagement. Again and again, life reveals the same principle. What develops is often what is practiced, which raises an intriguing question. If attention strengthens what it repeatedly focuses upon, then what kind of future are we rehearsing every day? Are we rehearsing limitation or possibility? Are we rehearsing fear or growth? Are we rehearsing distraction or presence? The answers to those questions may influence far more than we realize, because the future is not created entirely in a single dramatic moment. It is created through countless moments of attention unfolding across time. Each moment seems small. Together they become a life. And perhaps this is where the science of consciousness and the wisdom of human experience begin converging. Both suggest that who we become is shaped not only by what happens to us, but by how we participate in what happens, how we interpret, how we respond, how we adapt, how we learn, how we direct awareness. The process is ongoing, never fully complete, always unfolding, and the deeper we explore it, the more we may discover that the greatest mystery is not whether consciousness can influence human experience, but how profoundly human experience itself may be designed to expand consciousness through challenge, through curiosity, through connection, and through the endless opportunity to become more aware of what has been quietly present within us all along, waiting to be recognized as we continue our exploration of the extraordinary potential hidden within the human mind. As I continue exploring that potential, I find myself returning to a simple observation. Human beings are remarkably adaptable. We often forget this because adaptation usually happens gradually. Day by day, experience reshapes us. New information alters our understanding. Challenges reveal strengths we did not know we possessed. Relationships teach us lessons that no book could fully capture. Then one day we look back and realize we are no longer the same person who began the journey. The change feels sudden in hindsight, but it was built through countless small moments of growth. This pattern appears everywhere in nature. Mountains are shaped grain by grain. Rivers carve stone drop by drop. Forests emerge seed by seed. The most powerful transformations often occur through accumulation rather than dramatic events. Perhaps consciousness develops in much the same way. A single insight may not transform a life, but a series of insights applied consistently over time, can alter an entire future. This realization has changed how I think about progress. For many years, I believed meaningful change should feel dramatic, obvious, immediate. Yet reality often operates differently. The deepest changes are frequently subtle at first. A slight shift in perspective, a new question, a different response to an old challenge. These changes seem insignificant in isolation, yet they alter the trajectory of experience. And trajectory matters more than speed. Imagine two airplanes leaving the same airport. One adjusts its direction by only a few degrees. At first, the difference is almost invisible. Hours later, they arrive in entirely different destinations. Human lives often unfold in a similar way. Small shifts in awareness can produce profound differences over time. A person begins practicing gratitude. Another develops emotional awareness. Someone chooses curiosity over cynicism. Someone else decides to question an old limiting belief. The immediate effects may appear minor. The long-term effects can be extraordinary. This is why I believe consciousness deserves far more attention than it often receives. It sits upstream from so many aspects of experience. Before behavior comes perception. Before perception comes attention. Before attention comes awareness. The quality of consciousness influences everything that follows. Yet many of us spend more time studying the external world than understanding the internal processes through which that world is experienced. There is nothing wrong with exploring the external world. It has given humanity incredible knowledge. But perhaps the next stage of growth requires a deeper balance between outer exploration and inner understanding. Because without self-awareness, knowledge can become fragmented, information can become overwhelming. Technology can advance faster than wisdom, and wisdom may be the quality that determines how effectively we use everything else. Wisdom is not merely knowledge. Knowledge tells us what is possible. Wisdom helps us understand what is meaningful. Knowledge expands capability. Wisdom guides capability. Both are essential, yet wisdom emerges through reflection, experience, and awareness. It cannot simply be downloaded. It must be cultivated. This brings me back to a question that has quietly followed us throughout this exploration. What does it truly mean to realize human potential? For many people, potential is associated with achievement, accomplishing goals, reaching milestones, creating success. These pursuits can certainly reflect aspects of potential, but I suspect the deeper expression of potential involves something more fundamental. It involves becoming increasingly conscious, increasingly aware, increasingly capable of engaging with life intentionally rather than automatically. Because external achievements, valuable as they may be, are often temporary. Circumstances change. Conditions change, opportunities change, yet awareness remains a lifelong companion. The quality of our consciousness influences every experience we have, regardless of circumstance. This is why inner development may be one of the most valuable investments available to us. Not because it guarantees specific outcomes, because it improves our capacity to navigate whatever outcomes arise. A calm mind responds differently than an anxious one. A clear mind responds differently than a confused one. A resilient mind responds differently than a defeated one. The external situation may remain unchanged. The experience of it transforms completely. And perhaps that transformation is one of the most practical forms of manifestation imaginable. Not changing reality through force, changing our relationship with reality through awareness. From that shift, new possibilities naturally emerge. What fascinates me is how often these possibilities remain hidden until we are ready to perceive them. A solution can exist for years before someone recognizes it. An opportunity can remain invisible until attention shifts. A strength can remain dormant until circumstances demand its expression. In this sense, potential is not always something we create. Sometimes it is something we uncover, something that was present all along, waiting for the right conditions to emerge. The challenge is that modern life often pulls attention outward, notifications, distractions, endless streams of information. These forces compete constantly for awareness. As a result, many people spend little time exploring the deeper dimensions of their own consciousness. Yet within that unexplored territory may lie some of the most important discoveries they will ever make. Not discoveries about the world, discoveries about themselves, their assumptions, their values, their fears, their strengths, their capacity for growth. These discoveries can alter the course of a life, because once awareness expands, previous limitations often begin to look different. Not all obstacles disappear, but new pathways become visible. New choices become available. New futures become imaginable. And imagination, as we have seen repeatedly, is one of the engines of transformation. Every meaningful change begins as a possibility held within awareness. Before a bridge exists, someone imagines it. Before a movement exists, someone imagines it. Before a different life exists, someone imagines it. Imagination opens the door. Action carries us through it. Consciousness connects the two. The more I reflect on this process, the more I believe that human potential may be far greater than our current understanding suggests. Not because we are destined for perfection, not because limitations do not exist, but because consciousness itself appears capable of continual expansion, continual learning, continual refinement. And if that is true, then every person carries within them the possibility of becoming more aware tomorrow than they are today, more resilient, more compassionate, more intentional, more connected, more capable of expressing the highest aspects of their humanity. That possibility may ultimately be the most inspiring discovery of all, because it means the story is never finished. The future remains unwritten. The next level of understanding remains available. The next breakthrough remains possible. And as humanity continues exploring the mysteries of consciousness, perception, belief, and transformation, we may eventually discover that the greatest frontier was never somewhere beyond us, it was always within us, quietly unfolding through every experience, every challenge, every insight, and every moment of awareness that invites us to participate more fully in the extraordinary process of becoming.
One of the most important ideas explored throughout this discussion is that manifestation may have far less to do with magically attracting things into our lives and far more to do with understanding how consciousness, perception, emotion, and behavior work together to shape our experience of reality. To understand this, imagine that your mind is like a pair of glasses. Every day, you look at the world through those glasses. If the lenses are clear, you see opportunities, possibilities, and solutions more easily. If the lenses are clouded by fear, self-doubt, or limiting beliefs, you may overlook opportunities that are actually right in front of you. The world itself has not necessarily changed. The way you are seeing it has. Modern neuroscience gives us an interesting insight here. The brain is not simply recording reality like a camera. Instead, it constantly predicts, filters, and interprets information. Every second, your senses take in far more information than your conscious mind can process. To manage this overload, the brain decides what deserves your attention. Think about the last time you decided to buy a specific car. Suddenly, you started seeing that car everywhere. The cars were always there. Your attention simply became tuned to them. The same principle applies to opportunities, relationships, ideas, and possibilities. What you consistently focus on often becomes more visible in your experience. This is where belief becomes important. Belief is not merely positive thinking. Belief functions like a filter. If I genuinely believe growth is possible, I am more likely to notice opportunities to learn and improve. If I believe change is impossible, I may ignore those same opportunities even when they appear. This does not mean beliefs create reality directly. It means beliefs influence perception, and perception influences behavior. Behavior then influences outcomes. This simple chain explains much of what people describe as manifestation. Another important concept involves the connection between the mind and body. Many people think thoughts exist only in the brain, while emotions exist separately. In reality, the mind and body operate as an integrated system. When you feel anxious, your heart rate changes. When you feel calm, your breathing changes. When you experience excitement, your body responds physically. Your emotions are not abstract ideas, they are biological experiences. Researchers have shown that emotional states can influence stress hormones, immune function, attention, memory, and decision making. This matters because the emotional state you carry throughout the day influences how you interact with life. Imagine two people entering the exact same job interview. One enters feeling capable and prepared, the other enters overwhelmed by self doubt. Both possess similar qualifications, yet their emotional states influence how they speak, think, listen, and respond. The emotional environment within them affects the experience they create around them. This is why emotional awareness is so valuable. Many people try to change their lives by changing their thoughts alone, but thoughts and emotions work together. If someone repeats positive affirmations while internally feeling hopeless, the emotional experience often overrides the intellectual statement. Real transformation occurs when thoughts, emotions, and actions begin moving in the same direction. You can think of this as internal coherence. Coherence occurs when what you think, what you feel, and what you do are aligned. When coherence develops, decision making becomes clearer, energy becomes more focused, actions become more consistent, and consistent actions produce meaningful results. One practical exercise for developing coherence is a daily emotional check in. Several times throughout the day, pause and ask yourself, what am I feeling right now? Do not judge the answer. Simply observe it. Awareness is the first step toward transformation. You cannot change what you refuse to notice. Another powerful concept explored in the script is neuroplasticity. This scientific term simply refers to the brain's ability to adapt and reorganize itself. For many years, scientists believed the adult brain was relatively fixed. Today, we know the brain remains adaptable throughout life. Every repeated thought pattern strengthens certain neural pathways. Every repeated behavior reinforces specific habits. Imagine walking through a grassy field. The first time, there is no path. Walk the same route every day, and eventually a visible trail forms. The brain operates similarly. Repeated experiences create stronger pathways. This means your habits are not merely psychological, they are biological. The good news is that new pathways can also be created. This is why small daily actions matter so much. Many people underestimate the power of consistency because individual actions seem insignificant. But transformation is often the result of accumulation. 5 minutes of reflection each day may not seem life-changing. Practice consistently for years, it can completely alter self-awareness. 10 minutes of reading each day may seem minor. Over time, it can transform knowledge and perspective. One meaningful lesson here is that you do not need dramatic changes to create a different future. Small improvements repeated consistently often outperform massive efforts that quickly fade. Another important insight involves identity. Most people focus exclusively on changing outcomes, but outcomes are often the result of identity. For example, someone might say, I want to exercise more. A deeper question is, what kind of person am I becoming? A person who identifies as healthy naturally makes different decisions than someone who does not. A person who sees themselves as resilient responds differently to challenges than someone who sees themselves as fragile. Identity shapes behavior. Behavior shapes results. This is why personal growth is often less about acquiring new abilities and more about becoming aware of who you are capable of being. Finally, perhaps the deepest lesson of all is that awareness itself is a skill. Many people spend their lives reacting automatically. A situation occurs, an emotion appears, a reaction follows. But awareness creates space between the event and the response. Within that space lives choice. And choice is where transformation begins. When you notice a fearful thought without automatically believing it, awareness is present. When you pause before reacting in anger, awareness is present. When you consciously choose a response aligned with your values, awareness is present. These moments may appear small, yet they gradually reshape an entire life. The deeper meaning behind all of these ideas is simple but profound. Human potential is not something reserved for extraordinary people. It exists within ordinary moments of awareness. Every time you pay attention to your thoughts, you strengthen self understanding. Every time you regulate your emotions, you strengthen resilience. Every time you choose growth over limitation, you strengthen possibility. Transformation rarely arrives as a single dramatic event. More often, it emerges through thousands of conscious choices made over time. And perhaps that is the most empowering realization of all. The future is not created in one moment. It is created through the quality of attention, intention, and awareness you bring to this moment, and then the next, and then the next. Because ultimately, the greatest manifestation may not be the achievement of a particular outcome. It may be the gradual emergence of a more aware, more intentional, and more fully realized version of yourself.